Elijah Sterling stood at the edge of the long mahogany table, his reflection caught in the polished surface like a ghost of himself. The city skyline stretched wide beyond the glass walls of his penthouse office, sharp towers stabbing into the clouds. 32 years of calculated decisions, endless hours, and a relentless pursuit of perfection had built this empire, yet tonight he felt cornered. His board of directors had not spoken in suggestions, they had delivered ultimatums. A bachelor's image no longer fit the company's narrative of family, trust, and stability. Investors wanted a man anchored, not a solitary figure framed by neon and glass. Their solution had been cold and efficient. A contract marriage, no romance, no passion, simply a performance of domesticity for the sake of the brand. He had read the documents more times than necessary, 20 pages of boundaries, clauses, and legal assurance that nothing about this arrangement could threaten his control. No shared meals unless for appearances. Separate wings of the house. No physical contact, no entanglement. It was logic written into law, and Elijah thrived on logic. Yet as he leaned back, pressing his fingertips against the edge of the contract, something in his chest resisted the sterile finality of it. He ignored it. He had built his empire by silencing feelings that got in the way. Emma Rose sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap as though she were trying to keep them from shaking. She did not belong in this room of glass and steel, and perhaps that was what unsettled him. She carried a quietness that felt fragile but not weak, as though she had walked through fire and survived, even if the flames had stolen pieces of her. Her auburn hair was damp from the rain, a strand clinging to her cheek as if refusing to let her hide behind the mask she tried to wear. He had read her file. Once Sile, braided in the art world, her canvases had hung in prestigious galleries before the silence fell. There were fragments of a story about a man named Marcus, a gallery owner, but Emma had not elaborated and Elijah had not asked. It was not relevant to the contract, and yet when she lowered her eyes, he found himself wanting to know more than the ink on the page. The proposal came from his lips with practiced precision. 1 year of marriage, separate spaces, financial security guaranteed for her, public stability for him. No intimacy, no emotions, no complications. His tone was flat, professional, as though this were another acquisition. Emma listened, her breath shallow, her fingers twisting against each other beneath the table. Her landlord's notice, the unpaid bills, the ghosts of her ruined career, all of it pressed against her ribs, urging her to nod when every instinct begged her to run. She signed. Her hand trembled, the pen dragging slightly at the end of her name, as though her body rebelled against sealing this bargain. Elijah slid the papers into a folder, his movements crisp, detached. He told himself this was nothing but strategy, yet his eyes lingered on the fragile determination in hers, as if she were stepping onto a stage she did not believe in. The wedding was a performance dressed in silk and glass. Emma wore a designer gown chosen by Elijah's team, her smile rehearsed for the cameras that flashed like lightning. The vows were spoken with voices that belonged more to strangers than to partners. Elijah's kiss brushed her lips briefly, an act for the audience, nothing more. But in that instant, beneath the sterile brightness of chandeliers and the watchful eyes of business associates, Emma felt a flicker in her chest, an echo of something she thought long dead. She crushed it quickly. When the reception ended and the doors of the Sterling mansion opened, before her, she stepped into a world designed to impress but not to live in. Clean lines, expensive furniture, rooms that echoed with their own emptiness. Elijah guided her to the wing prepared for her, a private space with its own entrance, its own silence. An art studio stood ready, stocked with canvases she hadn't touched in over a year. They exchanged polite goodnights like actors closing a scene, their voices low, detached. As Emma lay on the pristine bed that did not yet feel like hers, she stared at the ceiling and told herself she had made the right choice. Survival was its own kind of courage. In another wing of the mansion, Elijah poured himself a drink and stared at the contract once more. It had solved the board's problem, but as he listened to the storm outside and thought of the way Emma had signed with trembling hands, he wondered if, for the first time in his life, logic might not be enough. The Sterling mansion stood on the hillside like a fortress of glass and stone, a place that looked beautiful from a distance but inside felt cold, untouched, and silent. Emma walked its endless halls with the careful steps of someone who did not want to disturb anything, her hand brushing against the polished walls as if to remind herself she was real. She had never lived in so much space, yet it felt like living inside a museum where every chair was too expensive to sit on, and every lamp too delicate to touch. Elijah moved through the house with the same precision he carried into the boardroom. He rose early, left before dawn, returned after nightfall, and buried himself in reports or phone calls that seemed to stretch into the night. The house became a stage where two people rehearsed their roles without ever colliding. Emma left quiet notes on the kitchen counter, short words written on heavy stationery in her neat script. "Thank you for the flowers in the studio. I will be ready for the gala on Saturday." Elijah's replies were equally brief. "Home late tonight. Driver will pick you up at 7. They were polite, efficient, and bloodless. But in the silence, Emma began to notice things. A book of art history had appeared in the library that had not been there before. The classical music that floated through the common areas was always playing softly when she walked in, as if someone was filling the emptiness with sound. The thermostat always seemed to rise just before thunderstorms rolled across the valley, as though someone knew she hated the chill and wanted to shield her from it. These were small things, gestures without acknowledgement, but they unsettled her because they felt too human for a man who claimed not to want connection. At night, the mansion changed. The wind whistled against the glass, the trees scraped against the windows, and every creak of the old floorboards echoed like footsteps in places that should have been empty. Emma lay awake in her wing of the house, her mind replaying memories she wished she could bury. Marcus's voice still lived inside her, sharp and cutting, reminding her of broken canvases and the night he swore she would never escape him. Sometimes she thought she heard his footsteps in the hall and sat up gasping until she realized it was only the house shifting in the dark. Elijah noticed her unease without asking. He told himself it was simply observation, part of maintaining order in a carefully arranged life. Yet he found himself listening for the sound of her bare feet crossing the hall when she went to the library late at night. He caught himself glancing at her reflection in the glass during charity dinners when she smiled politely at strangers. Something in her quietness pulled at him in ways he did not allow himself to explore. 3 months into their contract, their lives were perfectly rehearsed. To the world they looked like a couple in harmony, her hand on his arm as they entered gala halls, his proud smile when reporters asked about his talented wife. Behind closed doors they returned to their separate wings, their separate silences. But Elijah had begun to feel the weight of it pressing down on him, an emptiness louder than the applause of the crowd. Emma, in turn, found herself stealing glances into his study, wondering how a man could live surrounded by such success and yet look so alone when the cameras were gone. The storm that rolled over the valley one September night was the first time their distance began to crack. Thunder shook the windows and lightning carved the sky open in white flashes. Emma lay in bed, clutching the sheets as the sound pulled her back into memories she could not fight. She told herself she was safe, that Marcus was gone, but her body did not believe it. And somewhere across the house, Elijah paused in his study, pen frozen over a contract, because he thought he had heard something, a sound too raw, too human, to be explained by the wind. The night split open with a scream that did not belong to the storm. Elijah was halfway through a report when the sound reached him, sharp and desperate, cutting through the mansion's walls as though they were made of paper. He froze for only a moment, every rule of their arrangement pressing against him, whispering that her fears were not his concern. But instinct drowned logic, and before he could think he was moving through the long corridors, the sound of rain hammering against the glass chasing his steps. Emma thrashed in her bed, trapped in a nightmare that would not release her. Her face was wet with tears, her fists tangled in the sheets as if she were fighting something no one else could see. She cried out words that made no sense, pleas swallowed by the storm, but the terror in her voice was unmistakable. Elijah hesitated at the door, one last battle between distance and compassion, and then he stepped inside. He sat carefully at the edge of her bed, his voice low, steady, a lifeline cast into her chaos. Emma, Emma, you are safe. Wake up. His hand hovered inches from her shoulder before finally brushing against her skin, a touch so gentle it barely disturbed the air between them. Her eyes flew open, and for a breath she did not know where she was. The ceiling loomed above her like a prison, the storm outside a chorus of threats, until Elijah's face came into focus. His green eyes held none of the cold control she had come to expect. They held only concern. She curled into herself, pulling her knees to her chest, ashamed of the weakness she had shown. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice raw from crying. "I didn't mean to wake you." Elijah shook his head. "Don't apologize." His tone was different now, stripped of formality. "Do you want to talk about it?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Fragments at first, then whole pieces of a truth she had kept locked away. Marcus's promises, his charm, the way it had all twisted into something dark. The threats, the broken brushes, the night he had cornered her in the studio and told her she would never be free. Every syllable tasted of fear but also of release, as if the act of telling him was prying open a cage. Elijah listened, silent but not indifferent. Anger stirred in his chest, hot and unfamiliar, because this was not his battle to fight, and yet it felt like it was. She had walked into his life as part of a contract, an answer to a problem, nothing more. But now, watching her shrink into herself, he realized she had become more than that. She was no longer just a name on a page or a figure beside him at events. She was someone he needed to protect. He leaned closer, his voice steady as stone. He was wrong. "You are safe here. I will not let anyone hurt you." It was a promise that did not belong in the neat lines of their contract, a vow made in the dark between two people who were never supposed to need each other. Emma's shoulders eased slightly, her breath slowing, as though some part of her believed him. When she finally lay back down, Elijah stayed a moment longer, his hand lingering on the blanket near hers. The storm still raged outside, but the silence between them had changed. For the first time since their wedding, the distance they had built felt fragile, as though one more scream, one more touch, could shatter it completely. The morning after the storm, the mansion seemed different. The light through the tall windows was too sharp, the silence too heavy, as if the house itself knew something had shifted during the night. Emma sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the swirling steam as though it could hide her. She told herself the nightmare had been nothing more than a moment of weakness, that Elijah's presence in her room was an accident of compassion. But the memory of his voice pulling her out of the darkness lingered like a warmth she could not chase away. Elijah appeared in the doorway, still in his black suit, though he had canceled his early meetings, a rare crack in his routine. He poured himself coffee without a word and sat across from her. For a long moment they said nothing, but silence no longer felt like the barrier it once had. It felt charged, fragile, alive with all the things unspoken. Emma finally broke it. "You should not have come into my room." Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled against the porcelain. His reply was simple, unflinching. "I heard you scream. I could not stay away." The honesty in his tone left no space for argument, and she found herself staring at him, wondering how a man so controlled could sound so certain. The day carried on, but nothing returned to normal. Emma wandered the halls, her thoughts heavy, her mind replaying both the terror of her dream and the comfort that followed. Each creak of the floorboards, each flicker of light against the glass, reminded her that she was no longer invisible here. She had been seen. Elijah tried to bury himself in work, yet every line of every report blurred into the memory of her tears. He told himself he had overstepped, that their rules were there for a reason, but the image of her curled against the storm haunted him. That night the thunder returned, softer this time, like echoes of what had come before. Emma stood in the hallway outside his study, her hand raised but frozen in hesitation. She did not want to need anyone. She had promised herself never again. But her body remembered the safety of his voice, the promise that had cut through her fear. Before she could decide, the door opened. Elijah stood there, his tie loosened, his hair mussed from running his hands through it. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and something unspoken passed between them. "I cannot sleep," Emma admitted, her words barely above a whisper. "Neither can I," Elijah replied, though the truth was he had been listening for her footsteps. They ended up in the library, the storm pressing against the glass as the fire in the hearth threw soft shadows across the shelves. Emma curled in an armchair with a book of fairy tales, her voice quiet as she read passages aloud, her lips forming stories of brave princesses who fought their fears. Elijah sat across from her with his laptop open, but his eyes kept drifting to her, tracing the way her hair caught the firelight, the way her face softened when she was lost in the story. Hours passed unnoticed. When Emma finally fell asleep, the book slipping from her hands, Elijah closed his laptop and rose. He crossed the room, lifted her gently, and carried her through the halls to her wing of the mansion. She stirred only once, her hand brushing his wrist as he tucked her beneath the blanket. "Thank you," she murmured, and though her eyes remained closed, the words carried a depth that reached him. He lingered at the doorway, watching her sleep peacefully for the first time since he had known her. Something inside him shifted, dangerous and undeniable. Their contract had been built on walls, on separation, on rules written to keep hearts safe. But tonight, those walls had begun to crumble, and Elijah Sterling, the man who built his life on logic, felt powerless to stop it. The days that followed carried a different rhythm. Emma moved through the mansion with a little less hesitation, as if some of its cold edges had softened. Elijah began working from home more often, though he told himself it was only because his office felt too crowded with distractions. At night, the library became their quiet refuge. They spoke in half-sentences and unfinished thoughts, and yet those fragments held more truth than entire conversations with anyone else. But even as something tender began to stir between them, the shadow of Emma's past refused to stay buried. One evening she walked into her studio, intending only to look at the blank canvas that still waited for her, and found herself frozen. The smell of paint thinner, the echo of Marcus's voice, the memory of splintered brushes on the floor rose around her like smoke. Her chest tightened, her hands shook, and before she knew it, she had dropped to the ground, clutching herself against the wave of panic. Elijah heard the faint sound from down the hall. He should have ignored it. Their contract demanded distance, demanded he let her fight her demons alone, but he did not pause this time. He found her on the floor, her eyes wide with terror, her breath too shallow to hold. He knelt beside her, not touching, only speaking low and steady. "Emma, it's not him. He's not here. You are safe." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the battle between past and present. She wanted to believe him, but Marcus's voice was still louder than his own. He made a decision then, one that shattered the last fragile lines of their agreement. He reached out and took her hand, firm and grounding, anchoring her to the moment. Her trembling slowed, her breath steadied, and tears slid silently down her cheeks. When she could finally speak, her voice was broken. "He said I would never escape him, that he would always find me." Elijah felt anger flare hot in his chest, not the clean fury of business rivalries, but something darker and more personal. He had never met Marcus, yet in this moment he hated him more than he had ever hated anyone. He wanted to destroy the hold this man still had on her. Emma leaned against the wall, exhausted, her fingers still wrapped around his. "I don't want to be afraid forever," she whispered. Elijah's gaze held hers, his voice steady as a vow. "You won't be, not while I am here." For a long moment, neither of them moved, the weight of his promise hanging heavy in the air. They were no longer two strangers bound by paper and signatures. Something deeper had begun to form, something dangerous, because it could not be written into contracts or erased by legal terms. That night, after she had fallen asleep at last, Elijah stood at the window of his study staring out at the storm that rolled in over the city. Lightning carved across the sky, but all he could hear was her voice, her fear, her fragile courage. He thought he had built his life on logic, on walls too high for anyone to climb. But Emma had broken through without even trying. And though he did not know it yet, Marcus's shadow was not gone. It was waiting beyond the edges of their fragile peace, ready to test the vow Elijah had spoken in the quiet of her studio. The rain returned 2 nights later, harder this time, as if the sky itself wanted to test the fragile calm that had begun to grow between them. The storm swept over the hills with a fury that rattled the mansion's glass walls and set shadows crawling across the rooms. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the window where lightning split the darkness. Each clap of thunder echoed like a memory, dragging her back to the nights when Marcus's voice had been louder than the storm, when his threats had left her shaking in corners she once called safe. She rose, barefoot on the polished floors, her breath unsteady. Her steps carried her down the long hall almost without her choosing, until she found herself outside Elijah's study. She lifted her hand to knock but froze, caught between fear and shame. She had promised herself not to need him, not to lean on anyone again. Yet the silence of her wing felt too heavy and the storm outside too familiar. Before she could decide to retreat, the door opened. Elijah stood there, sleeves rolled up, tie abandoned on the desk behind him. His hair was slightly mussed from restless hands, and his eyes, sharp by day, softened when they found her. For a moment, neither spoke, and the thunder filled the silence. Then she whispered the truth she had tried to bury. "I cannot sleep." "Neither can I," he answered quietly. He had been listening for her footsteps all along, his heart pounding harder with every gust of wind outside. He gestured her in, and together they crossed the library's threshold. A fire burned in the hearth, throwing warmth into the vast room, the shelves lined with books that seemed to watch their every move. Emma curled into one of the armchairs, clutching a book she pulled from the nearest stack. It was a collection of fairy tales, stories of princesses and battles and endings she no longer believed in. Her voice trembled as she began to read aloud, soft words carrying through the storm. Elijah sat across from her with his laptop open, pretending to work, but his eyes never stayed on the screen. He watched the way the firelight touched her hair, the way her lips formed words she half believed. Her face, so often shadowed with fear, softened when she lost herself in the stories. And when she hummed unconsciously between passages, a sound so small and human, he felt something in his chest break open. Hours passed unnoticed. The storm outside raged, but in that room it felt distant, muffled by the fragile peace they had created. Emma's voice grew softer, her eyelids heavier, until the book slipped from her hands. She had fallen asleep, her breathing steady, her body finally at rest. Elijah closed his laptop, stood, and crossed the room. He lifted her gently, careful not to wake her, and carried her through the silent halls. She stirred as he laid her on her bed, her fingers brushing against his wrist before she sank deeper into sleep. "Thank you," she murmured, though her eyes never opened. He stood at her doorway, watching her in the glow of the storm-filtered light, and felt the weight of the vow he had never spoken aloud. He had promised himself he would never break the rules of their arrangement. Yet tonight, with her trust resting against his chest only moments before, Elijah understood the truth. The walls he had built around himself were already falling, and there was no turning back. The storm had passed, but the air in the mansion still felt heavy with electricity, as if the house itself remembered what had changed. Days slipped by, and Emma found herself drawn more often to the studio Elijah had prepared for her. At first, she only sat by the windows, staring at the untouched canvases that leaned against the wall. They looked like ghosts, waiting for her to decide if they would live or remain empty. Each time she tried to lift a brush, her hands trembled, the weight of Marcus's voice pressing down on her. "You will never paint again. You are nothing without me." But on a morning when the sun flooded the room in golden light, something inside her stirred. She dipped a brush into the blue paint, her fingers clumsy at first, and let the stroke fall across the canvas. It was uneven, imperfect, but it was hers. The sound of bristles against fabric was like a heartbeat she thought she had lost. One stroke became another, then another, until color spread wild and fearless across the canvas. Blue mixed with gold, sweeping into shapes that carried the ache of memory and the flicker of hope. When Elijah returned that evening, he found her standing in the middle of the room, her face streaked with paint, her eyes bright in a way he had never seen. She spun at the sound of his footsteps, startled, vulnerable, as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed not on the mess, but on the explosion of life on the canvas. "It's beautiful," he said softly, his voice stripped of its usual restraint. "It's not finished," she replied quickly, ashamed of the chaos she had made. The paint splattered across the floor. "The best things never are," Elijah answered. "They keep growing and becoming more than they were meant to be." Her breath caught because it felt like he was speaking about more than the painting. For a moment, the world around him faded, leaving only the colors between them and the truth neither dared to name. From that day forward, Elijah began working from home more often. He told himself it was efficient, but in truth, he wanted to be near her. He would stand at the doorway of the studio pretending to review documents, yet his eyes always wandered to the way she bent over the canvas, her body alive again with motion. Emma noticed but said nothing. She simply left small traces of gratitude, a mug of coffee waiting on his desk, a plate of food left near his laptop. But as the colors in her studio grew bolder, so did the shadows around them. One night after she left the gallery district where she had gone to gather supplies, she thought she saw a figure watching from across the street. Her breath quickened, her pulse racing with the old fear. Marcus's voice echoed in her mind, promising she would never escape him. She hurried back to the mansion, locking her door, telling herself it was only her imagination. Yet the chill remained long after. In the silence of his study, Elijah felt it too. Not the figure, but the danger. He had seen the way she looked over her shoulder when she returned, the way her hand trembled when she set down her bag. Something was coming, something that threatened the fragile trust they had begun to build, and though he had promised himself he would never break the rules, Elijah knew he was already preparing to fight them. The mansion slept beneath a silver moon when the nightmare came back for her. Emma's scream shattered the silence, sharper than the wind that pressed against the windows. Elijah was out of his bed before the echo had faded, his pulse thundering harder than the storm outside. The contract, the rules, the distance, all of it dissolved in the instant he heard her voice. He found her tangled in the sheets, eyes closed, fighting enemies that lived only in memory. Her hands clawed at the air, her voice breaking into cries that made his chest ache. Elijah sat beside her, his hand firm on her trembling shoulder. "Emma, it's me. You are safe. Wake up." Her eyes opened wide, wet with terror, and before she could speak, she reached for him, clutching his hand like it was the only thing anchoring her to the present. She did not let go, and neither did he. He had told himself he would never cross this line, but tonight she pulled him across it without a word. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she whispered, her voice cracked and fragile. Elijah leaned closer, his thumb tracing slow circles against her palm. "You don't have to be. Not with me." The space between them closed with no ceremony, no thought. She leaned against his shoulder, her body trembling as if it had been waiting for this shelter all along. His arms came around her, not as a husband bound by duty, not as a man protecting an arrangement, but as someone who had already chosen her without admitting it. They stayed like that through the night, talking in hushed voices while the mansion breathed around them. She told him pieces of her past she had never shared before, the nights Marcus kept her locked in her studio, the threats that still haunted her sleep. Elijah listened, his jaw tight, his silence heavy with rage at a man he had never met. When she faltered, he spoke words that steadied her. "You are more than what he tried to break. You are not his to destroy." As dawn crept through the curtains, Emma lifted her face from his shoulder, her eyes swollen from tears but clearer than he had ever seen them. "I thought I was broken beyond repair," she said softly. He shook his head. "You are not broken. You are stronger than anyone I know." The first kiss came without plan. Her breath caught, his gaze dropped to her lips, and suddenly the distance between them was gone. It was not the cold, staged kiss of their wedding. It was real, trembling, filled with the weight of every moment they had denied themselves. When she pulled back, her cheeks burned, her eyes wide with fear and wonder. Elijah only whispered, There are some rules I cannot keep anymore. The morning light spilled over them, warm and golden, as if the house itself had surrendered to what had happened. For months they had lived like ghosts behind walls of paper and silence, but one night of screams and confessions had burned those walls down. The contract still existed on paper, but in their hearts it was already ashes. The morning carried a stillness that felt dangerous, as if the mansion itself knew the lines they had crossed in the night. Emma sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across her hair, her fingers curling around a mug of coffee she had barely touched. Elijah entered quietly, his movements controlled, but inside his chest his heart refused to calm. For months their marriage had been built on paper rules, and now one choice had burned them away. They ate in silence at first, the sound of cutlery against porcelain louder than any words. Emma's thoughts tumbled in circles. She remembered the heat of his arms around her, the way his kiss had silenced the fear that had stalked her for years. She should have been terrified of what it meant, but instead she felt something more dangerous than fear. She felt hope. Finally, unable to carry the weight of silence, she lifted her eyes. "What if we didn't get divorced?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but the words landed between them like thunder. Elijah froze, his green eyes searching her face for hesitation, for regret. Instead, he found only trembling honesty. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he already knew. Emma set down her mug, her hands shaking. "I'm saying this stopped being pretend for me. I'm saying I think I've fallen in love with my fake husband and I don't know how to take it back." The confession hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. For a heartbeat, Elijah could not move, could not speak. Every rule he had written, every boundary he had drawn, warned him to step back. But then he remembered her scream in the night, her hand clutching his, her voice whispering that she didn't want to be afraid anymore. And he realized he had been lost long before this morning. Relief broke across his face, unguarded, raw. "I was hoping you would say that," he admitted, his voice rough with truth. "Because I have been in love with you for months, and the thought of you walking away when the year ends terrifies me." Her breath caught, her eyes wide. The tension that had bound them snapped in an instant as he reached across the table and took her hand. The touch was no longer an accident, no longer a crack in the rules. It was a choice. Their lips met again, tasting of coffee and fear and something that felt like freedom. But even as warmth flooded through them, suspense coiled around the edges of their fragile happiness. Emma's art had begun to bloom again, each canvas brighter than the last, and with it came whispers from the world she had left behind. A message had arrived that morning, hidden among the gallery invitations and polite notes from Elijah's team. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakable. 3 words that chilled her blood. "I found you." She had not told Elijah yet. She sat across from him, her hand in his smile breaking every wall she had ever built, and inside she carried the secret weight of Marcus's shadow pressing closer. For the first time in years, she wanted to believe in a future. But the past was not finished with her, and soon it would come knocking. The day of their second wedding dawned bright. The sky stretched in flawless blue, the air carrying the scent of roses that Emma had chosen herself. It was nothing like the first wedding, staged under cold chandeliers and the flash of cameras. This one was small and alive, filled with the warmth of friends who believed in her art and family who believed in his heart. Emma walked toward Elijah in a dress she had painted by hand, tiny blossoms scattered across the fabric like a meadow in bloom. Elijah's eyes glistened when he saw her. Not with calculation, not with control, but with a love so fierce it broke through every defense he had once carried. Their vows were not read from a script prepared by lawyers. They were spoken with trembling voices that promised only one thing: to choose each other every day, no matter the storms that came. When their lips met, the applause rose around them, but all Emma heard was the steady beat of his heart against hers. For a moment it felt as if the past had finally loosened its grip, as if the shadow of Marcus had been erased by sunlight. But the shadow had not disappeared. It waited until nightfall. After the celebration ended and the guests were gone, Emma returned to the mansion with Elijah, laughter still clinging to the air. She placed her bouquet on the table in the library and turned to find him watching her with that unguarded smile she had learned to crave. Yet beneath the warmth she carried a secret weight, the note she had hidden days ago. 3 words written in the sharp strokes she would never forget. I found you. She had not told Elijah, not wanting to poison the joy that had begun to grow between them. But as the firelight flickered across his face, she knew she could not keep it any longer. Her voice trembled as she confessed, the words falling like stones. He knows where I am. Marcus sent me a message. Elijah's expression did not falter. He crossed the space between them, took her trembling hands in his, and whispered the truth he had been keeping. I know. Emma froze. His voice carried no surprise, only certainty. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folder, placing it on the table between them. Inside were documents, photographs, and reports, evidence of the quiet war he had been waging behind the scenes. Marcus had tried to poison her name again in the art world, sending whispers to gallery owners, planting doubts in collectors. He had tried to follow her, tried to break her as he had once before. But Elijah had been watching. He had tracked every move, silenced every rumor, crushed every attempt before it could reach her. I promised you were safe, Elijah said softly, his voice carrying the weight of nights she had never known. I meant it. Marcus has no power over you anymore, not while I am here. Emma's breath caught, tears spilling down her cheeks. She thought of the months she had lived in silence, afraid of shadows, and of the man who had stood guard without demanding her trust until she was ready to give it. Her heart swelled, and with a love that was no longer fragile, no longer bound by fear. She reached for him, her painted dress brushing against his suit as she pressed her forehead to his. You were my contract, she whispered, but you became my choice. He kissed her then, fierce and unshaken, sealing the truth neither of them would ever doubt again. Years later, when people asked how their story had begun, Emma would smile and say it started with rules that were never meant to hold. She would speak of a marriage built on paper, of nights filled with silence, of the scream that broke the walls they thought would keep them safe. And Elijah would only look at her with that same unguarded smile, because they both knew the truth. They had agreed to no intimacy, but her midnight screams had made him break the rules, and in breaking them he had found the only love he would ever need.